Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll let some folks jump in here and we'll get started on today's discussion of production QC and conflict checks. All right, thanks everyone for joining today's discussion on production QC and conflict checks. Really appreciate it. Before we begin, here are some notes about RCE credits. RCE credits can take up to 1 week to be reflected in your certification tracker. Additionally, you can only receive RCE credits for a specific live webinar or self-paced video once per certification year. If you view the webinar live, you will receive RCE credits for the viewing the self-paced video. You cannot receive credits for the self-paced video in the same year as the certification year. If you'd like to register for one of our upcoming live webinars, please visit the Relativity Training Center. All right, in order to communicate with us during today's webinar, please use the Q&A box. This allows you to ask us questions throughout the presentation. We'll hold off on answering these questions until the end, but feel free to ask them as they come up. If you have not already done so, please type yes into the question box if you can hear me and see the screen. All right. Seeing some yeses, some familiar names in there. Thanks all. Really appreciate it. My name is Jonathan Lougheed, and I'm a member of the Customer Enablement team. Our team's mission is to provide a seamless transition from technical to workflow enablement by providing a segment-tailored onboarding experience, followed by a lifetime of expert workflow advice. I'm joined today by my colleague, Jill Reagan from Community Enablement, whose mission is to educate, advise, and inspire our customers to make the best use of Relativity.
Thanks, John. And just a little background on John and myself and why we think this session is important. John and I have worked together for many years, and prior to joining Relativity, we managed and administered e-discovery projects at a service provider. Productions were a big part of our daily work, and having thorough pre-production conflict checks and post-production QC checks were crucial to ensuring the work product was delivered correct and that our customers were not inadvertently producing documents that they did not want to produce. Even some of my most savvy clients would occasionally miss a conflict in their own pre-production checks, and post-production QC provided the opportunity to triple check that production was run correctly. We now see customers who are venturing into the world of running their own productions for the first time and are not always sure how to go about running some of these checks. So we wanted to share our knowledge and experience. Productions can often be complex, and as annoying as some of these checks may seem, when you're just trying to get a production out the door in a short amount of time, they will often save you from many headaches down the road. So with that background, our agenda for today. We'll first talk through some questions to ask and information to gather as you begin thinking about producing documents, maybe even at the beginning of discovery. We'll then talk through some options for running pre-production conflict checks and setting up for your production. After that, we'll give you some best practices when running your production and wrap with QC checks you should perform post-production. Of course, at the end, there will be time for Q&A. First, I want to quickly walk through the traditional production workflow, and you'll notice that this webinar generally tracks. First, there's some information that you'll want to gather about how your reviewers are coding, what needs to be produced, and how it needs to be produced. Next, you'll run your pre-production conflict checks. You'll finalize your production searches and specifications, and you'll run your production. Once the production is run, you'll want to run some initial QC checks of your production in Relativity, export your production, and then finally run a full set of QC checks on your exported production before delivering. So let's talk about what information you need to gather. As I just mentioned, we're going to want to understand how the reviewers are coding. What fields are they coding in? Are there fields that must be looked at together, like privilege and redactions? What fields are required? You'll also want to know how to handle privilege documents. Are full families being withheld? Do you have native and image redactions? Are they coding for redactions in addition to applying redactions? You'll also want to ask if there's a production protocol that needs to be complied with, as this is often going to outline the form of production. And lastly, what needs to be produced? Are you producing responsive documents? How are your privilege documents supposed to be handled? All of those sorts of things. Once you have answers to these questions and you're given the go-ahead to start running production checks, you can begin your pre-production conflict checks. You can start reviewing pre-production conflict checks using the saved searches that we have preset in our current Relativity 1 review template. Alternatively, you can create your own. Either way, you'll want to have the information that you've gathered at your fingertips to make sure you set up your checks in accordance with how those reviewers are coding and what needs to be produced. I also recommend that you use a pre-production dashboard. Make sure that it's updated with the fields that you need to review to better visualize your conflicts. Creating a pre-production admin field and adding it to an admin layout will help to keep you organized and provide tracking for what you did. And lastly, develop a repeatable process. This will go a long way towards speeding up your pre-production conflict checks, making sure you aren't missing steps, and it will allow others to know what you did. So let's talk through a sample workflow if you choose to go the route of creating your own pre-production conflict checks. This is not the only way to do it, but I'm hopeful that this will give you some ideas and workflows to consider as you develop your own checks. First, you would want to create at least 4 saved searches. This is going to include an initial dynamic potential universe, including families if you're producing full families, a static search of these same documents so that your counts do not change if your reviewers are still coding, documents to withhold from the production set for further review by the case team, and then a final production set saved search. Next, you'll run through a series of filters and checks on your fields to identify any conflicts. If you do identify any conflicts, or maybe even blanks, you'll want to tag these in your pre-production admin field to be withheld for further review. Once you complete your checks, you can either have the case team review and resolve the conflicts prior to production, or you can move forward with the documents that do not have conflicts while the conflicting documents are resolved. So let's jump into Relativity to see what this looks like in practice. As I mentioned, we do have some pre-production conflict check searches set up in our review template in Relativity 1 already. You can find these under the Review Manager Searches search folder. They're under QC searches, pre-production QC searches, and we have about 12 of them in here. I recommend using these for preliminary checks, or if you're using the layout and coding fields designed for this review template. But let's walk through what it would look like if we created our own pre-production QC searches, as I just mentioned. I've already set up my admin production field as well as my saved searches. We'll look under our production preparation searches, prod 2. You can see that I have my initial search along with an initial with family. This allows me to look back at my original conditions for the production, as well as choose whether I'm going to include family or not. For today's purposes, I'm going to include family, so I'll click on my prod 2 initial with family search. And we have 410 documents. So I'm going to mass edit these in my admin field to be my prod 2 universe. As I mentioned before, this will allow me to run my pre-production conflict checks without fear of my counts changing because reviewers are still coding. Now we're going to want to take a look at the various fields in our workspace to see where we may have conflicts in our coding. And I'm going to bring in my pre-production QC dashboard for some additional visualizations. Now, this pre-production QC dashboard that I just pulled up, this is in our review template as well. I have gone ahead and made some additional updates to this dashboard based on coding fields that I'm going to be using today. So certainly make sure that you go in and update those dashboards based on how your reviewers are coding. So first, let's take a look at responsiveness. I know I have 410 documents in my universe, as well as for the total in the bottom right corner. My widget up here for responsiveness is telling me I have 400 responsive documents and 7 non-responsive documents. So it seems I might be missing 3 documents somewhere. So let's pull in blanks to see if maybe they don't have coding, and it looks like they don't. So I'm going to want to first tag these 3 documents to be withheld for further review by someone from the case team. To filter these documents, I can either click directly in the widget, or I can filter in my document list, whatever is more comfortable for you. Today, I'm going to filter in my widget. So I've identified my 3 documents. And I'll go ahead and mass edit these documents to be withheld. Prod to withheld in my pre-production checks. Now, since we're reviewing or producing by full families, I'm going to tag my entire family to be withheld. This will make sure that down the road, as I'm going through checks or if I'm tagging my final production, I'm not tagging family members and accidentally bringing in those documents that were supposed to be withheld. So we'll go ahead and mass edit the full family to be withheld. Okay, so back to our universe. We now have 402 documents. That's because those 8 documents, the 3 that didn't have responsiveness coding, as well as their family members, have now been tagged as withheld. And the universe save search, just for your knowledge, is the documents that are tagged in universe, but are not tagged for withheld. So now we'll go through and continue to run some conflict checks on additional fields. First, let's take a look at our privilege widget. And we can see that we have some documents in here that are coded as privileged withheld. Now, generally, you might want to ask your case team, how are we handling these? Are these documents that we're going to produce with a privilege slip sheet and produce the rest of the family that's coded as responsive in full documents? Or do we want to withhold that entire family for production? That's some of that information that you would probably want to gather at the beginning of the case. But if this comes up and you don't have it, the best thing to do is withhold those documents and ask your case team. So let's go ahead and filter for our privilege withhold documents and withhold them so that we make sure to ask the case team. Again, we will choose our prod to withheld. We will jump into our withheld search to then withhold the entire families. And one thing that I would also recommend that I just want to mention while we're going through this process, I really recommend that you sort of show your work. Thinking back to maybe high school math or something of how did you get to this final end result? Maybe make a document where you're kind of showing what checks you did, how many documents were withheld, so that you can then show your case team, this is what I withheld and why. This gives them a checklist for documents that they need to look at, but it also tells them that you've gone through thorough checks and tells anybody else on your team what you did in case they need to pick it up later. Let's go back to our prod to universe now that we've withheld those privilege withheld documents. And one last thing I want to take a look at least for today's purposes, is privilege and redactions. So here we have our privacy redaction completed field. This should tell me that documents in our privacy redaction completed field have redactions on them. So we have 3 documents coded in this field, but in our markup set, we're only showing 2 documents with redactions. So this is telling me that either I have a document that's coded as privacy redaction complete that does not have image redactions on it, or maybe it has native redactions on it. Looking at my pre-production dashboard, I don't have my native redaction widget in here. So let's go ahead and add it and first see if that's where our discrepancy is. So we'll add our redact has native redactions. Looks like I have 1 document. So let's just filter down on our privacy redacted completed. 3 documents, 2 with redactions are blank. And we have our 1 document that has native redactions. So that resolves that issue and we're good to go there. And certainly having these dashboards and widgets available to me made it super easy for me to visualize where these conflicts might be. From here, you would continue to go through checks, checking all the fields that the reviewers are coding, checking all the fields that maybe are going to need to be somehow produced, something like confidentiality. Does this need to be coded for documents so it can be branded on your production documents? You would go through and double check all of these documents. And then you would send this withheld search to the case team to review those conflicts. From there, depending on if they want to resolve those conflicts prior to producing, or if they give you the go-ahead to produce any documents that do not have conflicts, you would then tag all of the documents in your prod 2 universe that have not been in the withheld search as your prod 2 final. So let's go ahead and do that for our purposes today. Okay, so our prod 2 final should now have those 375 documents in it. And next, let's talk about these 4 additional searches at the bottom that I have here in our prod 2 saved search folder. I'm going to jump back to our presentation to go through those. So setting up for your production. Few quick searches that you'll want to run through for your data sources. And these are going to be based off that final saved search that you have, and then be used for your production data sources. So first, this isn't really a production data source, but the production redactions saved search is going to be super helpful for QC purposes. The idea is that you pull in all documents in your prod 2 final search, all documents that are going to be produced that contain redactions, whether they're natives or images, so that you can then QC those and make sure that they are produced correctly. For data sources, we are going to want a saved search of documents to be produced natively. And this is going to include all documents that need natives produced that are both redacted and not redacted. You'll also want a saved search of documents to be produced as images only, and make sure that all documents within the search do actually have images. And finally, production custom placeholders. This search is for documents that will be receiving non-standard placeholders during production, such as maybe technical issue or privilege. You may need more than one of these searches depending on how many custom placeholders you plan to use.
Thanks, Jill, for taking care of all the hard parts. Now that the searches are all set, it should be smooth sailing running the production set within Relativity, assuming we continue to perform quality checks along the way. The first thing we'll want to do when setting up a production set is to ensure we're naming it properly. This is important for tracking purposes both within Relativity and within our deliverable, as it creates a field that can be exported as well as viewed within Relativity. We'll want to make sure that if productions have already been run in the workspace, that we're keeping in line with any previously used prefixes and ensuring that it's sequentially in order from past deliverables. This can sometimes be tricky if there are multiple matters being produced out of the same workspace. So it's important to make sure you're matching the prefix to the specific matter. From there, we'll need to determine the numbering type. Typically, the vast majority of productions I've run required page level numbering. However, we'll want to refer to any production requirements or specifications to confirm which type is needed. Similar to the production set name, we'll want to check to make sure we're using proper prefixes, especially if productions have been previously run and there are multiple matters being produced out of the workspaces. This is critical for the continue from previous option as well, which refers to the prefix field when generating the next available number. We can use this feature to populate our start number to ensure we're continuing from past deliverables. However, you want to make sure to double check any specifications to verify you actually have the correct starting number. And if this production set is your first production set, you have the easy option of starting with the number 1. For the padding, we'll default to 7 digits. For most cases, it's just fine, but if you're expecting to produce a significant amount of documents, you might want to consider increasing this value. That said, if you're continuing from a previous production, you just want to make sure that you'll use whatever padding was previously chosen. And finally, a very important part that I've seen missed by some of the best litigation support professionals is setting the attachment relational field. Its location and the fact that it's optional sometimes gets quickly overlooked. So please make sure you're aware of its importance. And if you're producing families, you'll want to make sure to absolutely set this to your workspace's family group field. This will ensure the attachment numbering field is properly populated. Once we've squared away our numbering options, we'll want to ensure we're branding our production properly. The location is often agreed upon prior to the production and included in the specifications. That said, if confidentiality language is being stamped, it's typically in the lower left-hand corner of the page. And if page number is being stamped, it's typically in the lower right-hand corner. But again, we'll want to double check our production deliverable requirements to ensure those locations are accurate. If we're endorsing any data based on a fielded value, we'll also want to perform checks prior to running the production. The first we'll want to do is to ensure that the field is properly populated. Additionally, if the spelling or language varies from what should be endorsed on the page, it's worth having a discussion with the case team to ensure the language used for coding documents matches what will be used for endorsing those documents. Having to create a new field and populating it with a modification of coded values tends to lend itself to a multitude of errors. Another important step when setting up a production is ensuring the sort order when numbering the documents. Typically, this will be requested in the specifications, but it could vary. If there is no specified sort order, you should at a minimum ensure the production is being sorted by the control number. If not, this will default to sorting by artifact ID, which, depending on if there are errors during processing or loading, could cause families to not fall concurrently. When we get to the stage of assigning the production data sources, we'll want to use the searches Jill previously created while continuing to use good naming conventions. It's important to name the production data source to something similar to our saved search. This will ensure a quicker, easier QC when reviewing everything prior to running our production set. It also helps to ensure we're selecting the desired production type and whether we're producing images only for that saved search, images in natives, or just natives. These good naming conventions, referencing our saved searches, also help to easily identify which placeholders we need to use, and if data source requires exception placeholders, native placeholders, or custom placeholders. Ideally, these placeholders have already been templatized and added to our template workspaces prior to running a production, but if not, you can refer to your production specifications and create a custom placeholder at this stage. Finally, one of the most important steps in any production is ensuring we're burning in redactions to make sure that confidential information is not being turned over. This can be done right from our standard searches. Just make sure that if there are multiple markup sets, we're choosing the right markup sets for this particular matter. If at any point you perform native redactions through Relativity 1's redact, the system needs to be told which native file to export as part of a production set. In order to do so, you'll need to create a production preparation project through redact. Doing so will lock the native field, and it will ensure the proper redacted text is generated in the production OCR field. This is in addition to the steps you'd normally take to OCR your image redactions after running your production set. After running a redaction project, you can successfully export both the redacted native and text for your production deliverable. All right, after exporting our production, there are still some steps we'll want to take to ensure we're delivering a quality production. The first is to check and modify our header row field names in our deliverable load file. Referring to our production deliverable requirements or specifications, we'll want to modify the field names to match those requested. I would suggest saving a copy of your load file prior to making any modifications though, just in case. Often the requested fields aren't a one-to-one match of relativity fields, so you'll typically have to make minor adjustments here. Make sure to check your spelling when complete. After modifying the header row, we'll want to ensure all of our fields were properly exported. This includes both our load file pathing information and the files themselves. First, let's check our load file to ensure we have the proper amount of text paths and native paths. The text paths should match our total files, and the native paths should match our previously created production search for those native files. Next, we'll want to ensure we actually have all the files we planned on delivering. This is a quick check, and we just need to make sure the total rows in our DAT or deliverable load file match our total production count. Remember to subtract the header row from the overall count though. Here we'll check our image load file. First, checking the total count of Ys. This Y value represents in an OPT the first page of each document, and it should match our total document count. Next, we'll want to ensure our total rows matches our total page count. Additionally, we can check the page range here and make sure that that matches our expectations. To tie it all together, we'll want to check the actual file counts themselves. Not only will we want to make sure our image, native, and text counts match our expected counts, but we can take a look within the folders themselves to ensure they are named accurately and formatted properly. After confirming our counts, we'll need to make sure the pathing information works to ensure the deliverable will successfully load upon arrival. For this check, we just want to make sure the pathing information from where our load file is located will continue to the actual files themselves. You can perform a quick check in the folder browser by starting at where our load files are located and pasting that pathing information from the load file into your Windows folder browser. This should open up the files themselves. Of note, this may vary depending on the location of your load file, but you want to make sure this works regardless of your deliverable requirements and that location of that load file. An incredibly critical step to our checks is those for checking for redactions. We want to ensure that they were exported properly. As an important PSA, please make sure that when creating your OCR set, you choose the production set and not the saved search. Also, make sure when exporting via the Relativity desktop client that you're choosing the text precedence in order to ensure the production OCR field is being provided before the extracted text field. When checking for redactions, you'll want to first refer back to your saved search, identifying your redaction records and referencing the production Bates number. From there, you'll want to check the images, notice if you've natively redacted anything, and text, ensuring that the deliverable is properly redacted and not providing any of that privileged information. If you're struggling to find the location of a redaction, you can always use the markup set navigators as it can quickly and easily jump you to the redaction location within a document. In addition to checking redactions, we'll want to ensure that the images are accurate for any documents we've provided placeholders for. Again, we'll refer to our relativity searches to identify the production Bates numbers for our placeholders. After identifying some documents, we'll want to check the images within the deliverable. Additionally, if any text was OCR'd based upon the placeholder, we'll want to check to ensure that that text was delivered properly as well. Next is another easy but important check, making sure that our branding is in the right location and displaying properly. To do so, we'll check multiple images, making sure any header or footer information is in the right location. If any confidential language was used for branding, we'll also want to double check the spelling and refer to Relativity for some example documents for the different messaging variations that may have occurred. Now, this isn't a step that would just occur at this point. This is hopefully something that has been going throughout the entire production deliverable process. And that is performing some production QC checks. And this can be done via production QC checklist. Here's a mock-up of a workflow QC checklist that could be used when setting up and running a production. As you can see, it outlines the workflow steps that we've built with logical checks along the way. It can be used by a single individual or in collaboration with others, and it can even include a possible second QC. Well, this is an example based in Excel. This type of workflow checklist can be created and used in a variety of tools. If you're not already using some form of workflow QC checklist when running a production, I would strongly suggest doing so. Throughout the years, these types of checklists have saved me and colleagues countless times. When errors are detected, it can provide great opportunities to review the existing checks and/or provide additional training on the production workflow. Finally, as an admin, it's always a great idea to test load the deliverable to ensure that it will load accurately upon arrival. Well, we've done numerous checks already along the way. This is a great final test. There are a variety of tools you can use to test load production deliverables, including your own Relativity instance. I've used a variety of tools over the years for test loading deliverables, and each offers its own unique advantages. With that, I'll turn back over to Jill for QCing as a project manager.
Thanks, John. So as a project manager, or even as an end user, I recommend QCing many of the same things that John just talked about as an admin, although maybe to a little bit lesser of an extent, because in reality, your admin should have done all of these checks already. But certainly an extra set of eyes on each of these items won't hurt. So let's just walk through them again real quick. 1, confirm your start number. I know John mentioned this when setting up your production, but it's always great to confirm it once it's been exported as well. Header row and field names. Make sure that those field names match your production specifications, match your production protocol, and match what has been requested from the case team. Total records exported. Double check the number of text files, native files, and images. That's what you've created those searches for. That's what you've done these pre-production checks for. So go ahead, check those in Relativity, check them outside of Relativity at the export location. Spot check your redactions. Even though your admin has likely already done this, check them again. Do your own spot check. You might be checking different documents than your admin did, and it's always great to check more redacted documents than less. Spot check your placeholder language. Make sure that your native placeholders have native language. Make sure that your privileged placeholders have privileged language. Tech issue, same. If there's text that's associated with those placeholders, double check the text of those files as well. Make sure your branding is in the correct location and it's accurate. And also, if you have access to test load tools, go ahead and test load it yourself. I used to test load my own customers' productions as well as my admins, and it was always a great last check. So just a quick recap, let's run through that production workflow again. First, you're going to gather all of that information, how your reviewers are coding, how you need to produce, is there a production protocol, what are you doing with privileged documents, run those pre-production conflict checks, finalize your searches and specifications, set up and run your production, run some quick QC checks in Relativity before you export, go ahead and export it, and finally run through that whole list of QC checks that John talked through, that I talked through at the end before you send off that production deliverable. So thanks for sticking with us today. Let's look at what questions we have.
All right, looks like we have one from Anthony here. What QC scripts are available and where can I locate those? So as far as, QC scripts and stuff, as we kind of showed and alluded to, right? It's more kind of checks that you are building along the way as you're going through the process of running a production and prepping for a production. That said, we've both worked at a place where we previously had some checks that were kind of automated, right, as part of the deliverable QC process. So there are things you can internally do, but really not like a script per se that you can run within the system. Be like, hey, make sure my production's, running great. I don't know, Jill, anything you want to add to that one?
No, as far as things like pre-production conflict checks, unfortunately, because everybody sets up their coding a little bit different, because every production requires something a little bit different, a lot of it is going to kind of be manual. But if you set up some of these base searches at the beginning and then set it up in sort of that first set of production searches, you can then make copies of those searches and update them for your next production. So it's sort of like a template for each subsequent production within your set.
Yeah. And the more you can do to standardize and kind of develop this is our production deliverable standards, right? More of a repeatable process. If you can templatize those at the, instance level, right? Hey, for each production, these are the common fields we use to identify our conflicts. These are common fields we use to identify things we're going to produce, right? All that stuff can really make it a lot easier and quicker for you to kind of go from production to production. If each workspace has different choices and different conflict checks you're going to have to search for, that becomes pretty hard to manage, and you have to have more specialized case knowledge versus having production knowledge, if that makes sense. All right. Well, you want to go in with the next one, Jill? Sorry, go.
Sure. I was just gonna mention this additional question from Anthony of why is a search for PII info not part of your standard QC searches, and how would you create this particular type of QC search? So ideally with PII, that's going to be something that's part of your review, as well as your QC of those reviewed documents. So if you're running PII to redact it, going through QCing those redactions prior to production, you can certainly add in a QC check for PII if you'd like to. You would just add that into your standard checks for that particular matter or for all of your matters. Like I mentioned, I only ran through a couple checks here. John only ran through some on his end. There's tons more checks that you could do. So just make sure that you build that into your particular pre-production conflict checks or post-production QC.
Yeah, and for some of the PII stuff too, depending on if you're in Relativity 1 or not, or, Relativity 1 offers redact, right? It can search for and redact potential PII stuff using some regular expressions. Blackout, if you're on server, right, is something offered through Malili that can do something similar, right? So there are things you can do to identify and hopefully make your life easier when producing PII, and definitely take a look at some of those tools if you haven't done so already. See some familiar names on the attendee list and questions. Kristen, yes, we can confirm you are pretty darn solid at checking and prepping for production. Do you have the PowerPoint? So as far as the PowerPoint goes, we do not currently provide PowerPoints after these decks. I know a lot of the assay experts previously did, but not currently. That said, this will be available to watch in our self-paced webinars. So if you wanted to check it out, take a look at it again, it definitely will be available pretty shortly, usually within a day in our self-paced webinar area. All right, another question. What does original image numbering mean? So in that particular one, if you received some images from somewhere, whether that was, someone produced them previously and sent you like an image load file, or maybe they were export out from a different tool, that original image numbering will be what those images were named when you loaded them in, typically through, the RDC, possibly through integration points, but that's what that's referring to. Not often used when running a production. Usually when starting a production or running a production, right, you're being told like, hey, this is the prefix we kind of want to use. We're not really going to care about the original numbering. We want to make sure for these documents they're sequentially in order. So not as commonly used, but definitely something that has come up before in the past. Next question in here, is there a way to remove metadata for a document being produced as a privileged placeholder? Great question, and this is something that can be a little bit fun and at times interesting, and I say that very kindly. So there's a couple ways in which you can do that. The first option is you can create additional fields potentially within Relativity and clear those fields, or you can mass update them for everything, clear them for where they need to be removed for privileged information, and then kind of export out those additional fields. Obviously, that does add a lot of additional fields to relativity, can add some additional steps as far as the QC process goes. And it can be a little trickier to manage as far as just the production and setting it up and running it goes. That said, there are plenty of tools that are available outside of relativity. So like, some tools we've used in the past, we've actually, like Jill and I have worked with, that remove some of those fields in the deliverable load file. So we kept kind of the relativity fields, the same amount of counts, the same information, and we actually used a different tool post-export to remove some of that information that was considered privileged in the metadata. Jill, anything you want to add to that one?
No, you covered it actually.
Okay. Next question. Is it possible to rerun a production set with minor changes, less documents, and change production numbering? So there is a reproduction option depending on what version of relativity you are on. That is, man, it was great. Ivana Follow, I know, worked pretty hard on that one. What was it? Gosh, like a year and a half, 2 years ago, probably now. From the product team, and that's a really great feature. So if you had potentially a placeholder that now is needing images, right, you can run a reproduction set. It's just a mass action, and that will actually suffix the different pages for you. So you don't have to try to manually figure out how to suffix them. It'll feather it into your original production deliverable as well, and it creates a separate production set. So you can either A, choose to export out the sub-production set of just those documents you're reproducing, or B, you can export out the full production, which has since been merged with the reproduced documents. That also works for anything that was maybe like placeholder, so either placeholder previously or was imaged in full and now needs to be placeholdered. It will kind of, also do a placeholder for each page, which is really nice. And then if there's like redactions, right, or no redactions before, you can kind of swap out the redaction set too. So reproduction, real great feature. And again, depending on what version of relativity you're on, you should have access to it via a mass action. Good point. There was a note here. Header row field names on export can be renamed automatically if you use integration points on export. That is accurate. The text and native link fields don't appear to have that option. Is there going to be a feature update with those options? So, great point. If you do want to use integration points, that's absolutely a fantastic way in which you can export out data. More traditionally, it had been the Relativity desktop client, but I have worked with a few clients and a couple recently that really like integration points for both importing and exporting data. It gives them a little bit more insight from an environment level versus someone having that RDC installed locally. So definitely something to check out if you haven't seen integration points. It's not just workspace to workspace. As far as a feature with those options, it's something we can always bring back to our product team. There is some cool things as far as within Relativity 1, we're looking at web import export kind of coming out later this year, which will have some different options as well. But we'll definitely make sure to bring that feedback. It's something I would obviously love to be able to change those field names upon export, and hopefully someday that's something we'll see. Jill, anything you want to add that one?
No.
Okay. All right. Next one. Is there any updates on the horizon for metadata redactions within Relativity 1? I'm not sure. Jill, do you know?
I don't believe so. I work pretty closely with the Redact team, and there aren't any for metadata redactions that I'm aware of, at least not in the near term. But I will certainly bring this up with them as a possible feature for a future release.
All right, Anthony, wow, coming in with a lot of good questions. What tools can you use to test load? So, trying to stay somewhat tool agnostic, but I can talk at least a couple that I've enjoyed in the past. Relativity is a great and fine tool to test load in potentially, right? Like you could have a production workspace, and that's something that we've worked with clients on before. Is like, hey, let's create a workspace. So we call it the production workspace. All of the production deliverables we do, we will essentially load in there and kind of keep it tracked separately. So that's a great option. Additionally, if you have concordance or something like that, you can use concordance to test load, make sure it loads into a tool. Ready Suite was another tool that I really enjoyed using, in my vendor days, that seemed to have a lot of great options and was a really good test loading and, potentially modification tool as well. I don't know, Jill, if you want to add anything if you have a favorite tool of choice there.
I personally enjoyed Ready Suite mostly for the visual component that it had when I was QCing productions. It allowed me to test load and then also view it in more of a column view my DATs more of a column view as opposed to text editor. However, like John said, loading it into a production Relativity workspace is also a great option as well.
Yeah, because I mean, depending on some of the tools, right, they can get pricey, and we want to try to be conscientious of your costs going into using some of these things and running productions, right? Thank you for the compliments. Really appreciate you guys joining today. Is there any way to set the attachment field in the production as a default to pull the family field in? Great question, Kristen. That would be very helpful. I don't think there is a way to default it per se. That said, you can copy from previous production sets, but I don't know if there's like an instance way to say, like, hey, make sure it says, yeah, just be copying from it, previous ones, yeah. So once you get past the first one, hopefully it's a little easier. Can you provide, Chetan, if you want to shoot me a message or something like that at some point, I'd be happy to provide. I know we've been on some things in the past, so yeah, if you wanted that, I'd be happy to share that with you. I noticed no QC for dupes and near dupes of priv docs. Do you include that in your QC? Good question, Nicole. And again, it depends. Not every production is the same, as Jill and I have alluded to. There's, depending on the matter, what you're producing, how you're producing, right? These checks could definitely vary. And so we want to try to kind of hit the main ones here and make sure you guys are at least thinking about, like, hey, how can I maybe do this better? What are some things I can incorporate? As far as QC for dupes and near dupes, a lot of that's going to be coming down to review. I would not necessarily reference that as like a production kind of QC. I'd be more like, how are we planning on reviewing? And if we're producing, I guess, how have we determined that type of production, right? Do we need to produce all the textual near dupes? Probably not. Yeah, I don't know. Jill, what are your thoughts on that one?
Something like dupes and near dupes of priv documents, you're right. I think it is kind of review, but it is anticipation of production to make sure that your dupes and your near dupes have consistent coding. I would probably put something like QC of dupes and near dupes of privileged documents before you set up and run some of these pre-production conflict checks, sort of as part of like second level QC. If you're setting up particular batches or a workflow for a second level QC, maybe include your responsive documents, but also have some additional searches that pull in those dupes and near dupes of your privileged documents to double check those before everything goes out. There is a knowledge base article on our community site that walks through a process for QCing of duplicate documents or near duplicate documents. So certainly check that out, run a search for that, and it'll give you sort of a coding conflict check. It's a series of 2 to 3 searches that you can set up for duplicates, near duplicates, email thread groups to make sure that documents within those different groupings have consistent coding.
One of the other thing, and this just kind of is something I think can be very useful, right, is active learning is often, primarily used for a prioritized review type tool, right, and kind of going through and getting ready for the production. But one of the things it can be used for potentially is like a production QC, essentially, right? You could run active learning based on your coding decisions and potentially look at, like, hey, are there any outliers that are, considered non-responsive, or any things that are considered responsive that were tagged the other way, right? So that's something to also consider as kind of like a QC tool when running and preparing productions, is maybe, if you haven't used active learning, run active learning and see if there's any outliers on either the, positive or negative side of the active learning model. Next question. What about scripts for checking for redactions? So as far as redactions go, there's a couple things you can do. There are fielded values. So the markup set fields that Jill showed are, a really good way to kind of check and QC, like, hey, where are these markups occurring. If you did use redact or blackout, for example, there are some QC checks that are built into those tools to make sure you're going through and taking a look at the redactions, whether it's like a mismatch of, hey, I was expecting X amount of text, but I only have this many markups, right? That tool is really good about kind of performing some of those checks for you as you're going through and using redact or blackout. But again, not really like a default script that's available. It's mostly mainly through searching and through some of the checks built into some of the tools already. I don't know, Jill, you've worked a lot with redact. Anything you want to add there?
No, I would certainly use those, use the markup navigator if you're using even image redactions, native redactions, to go through and double check those redactions. But there's not per se a script that's going to identify those. Certainly look at the markup set fields as well as your native redaction fields. Those are going to be where you're going to identify documents that have redactions in them. And you may, kind of like how I was showing that I was looking at a redaction completed field. You might want to combine those redaction fields, the markup fields, with another coding field, maybe a privilege field or a redaction completed field of some sort, to make sure that those match together.
Andrew here with a very nice kudos. Thanks, buddy. Really appreciate it. Michael, do you have any tools or in the pipeline if clients want to redact all or portions of metadata fields that can be produced? For example, so again, right now, redact's primarily for like images or natives and stuff like that, but I'm sure, as Jill mentioned, that's something that we can obviously talk to the product team, provide this feedback. It's definitely something that, having run a ton of productions, it would have been really helpful to have the ability to potentially look at using redact or a similar tool for metadata fields for sure. Is there a quick cheat sheet of common errors and how to troubleshoot them in documentation? So I guess with errors for production, man, I'm trying to think of too many times where I've seen errors. I think most of the time with productions, if there were errors, it was often more size based, right? Like if you were trying to export out like a million documents, trying to run a production on a million documents, right? Sometimes you would get errors through that. Obviously you can retry, but as one of our colleagues, Chad Jones, always says, when in doubt, batch it out. If you are dealing with large document sets, if you can try to split it up and stuff like that, just to A, help with export deliverables, or B, help with running the production, that's always good. Checking your resources ahead of time. Relativity one, you don't have to as much, but if you're on server side, seeing what type of branding agents you have can always be really helpful. But yeah, I can't think of like a huge amount of errors that I really ran into in running productions per se. I don't know, Jill, any come to your mind?
No, I think the one that I've probably seen most recently has been when trying to reproduce a document set that maybe doesn't match the original production set. So if you're changing from images only to images and natives or vice versa, sometimes you might have issues reproducing those documents. You would need to create a new production set for that. Usually you can find something that will help you sort of troubleshoot that on our community site if you search the knowledge base articles. Alternatively, if there are some errors, certainly reach out to support@relativity.com and they can help you, guide you on those.
All right. One from Renee. When applying a production placeholder, do you have any recommendations on identifying the placeholder that is being applied, i.e. native privilege, et cetera? So kind of to the conversation we were talking about, throughout naming conventions, right? I think is always a really helpful way if you have your save search name similar to how you're creating it for your data source, and then you kind of tie that, any placeholder language, right? Like when you give it the placeholder a name, right? If you kind of keep those all in line, I think that really helps to identify, going back to the production, look at the sources. Okay, I see the native search had, here's my native data source. It was tied to the native search, and up it said I use the native placeholder. For me, that's oftentimes the best way of doing it, is like looking at the placeholder that was applied within the data source. Jill, I don't know if you want to add to that. I know sometimes there's fielded values too that you can update if you want, but.
There's nothing per se that I want to add to it, but I do think that that is a good feature request that we can certainly put in with our product team.
Yeah, like what actual placeholder was used for this one? Yeah.
John, there was a question that I saw that
did I miss one?
We skipped over a little bit. What information should I note for future reference and or attorney review? I would sort of write out kind of what checks you're doing. So for instance, when I went through the responsive check and I noticed that there were 3 documents that didn't have responsiveness coding. So maybe you'd have a line that said there's 3 documents with no responsiveness coding. There are an additional 5 documents in this search that are family members of those 3 documents. Or, there's 7 documents that are coded as privilege withhold. There's additional family documents. How are we handling these privilege withhold documents? Do we want to placeholder them? Do we want to withhold the entire family? If there's redactions that are missing, there are X amount of documents that are saying there should be redactions, but there are no redactions on these documents. So just kind of a general, here's what I looked for, here's what I withheld and why. They can be quick one-liners of just, here's what I checked, here's what I withheld, and ultimately why it was withheld.
Thanks, Jill. And sorry for skipping over that.
No worries.
What template workspace was used in that demo there? That was actually our Relativity 1 review template that had all those production searches in there. So you can always find those either A, in our community page, like our community section does have the templates available to download, as well as if you're in Relativity 1 customer, it should be in your staging area under the ARM folder. And it should also be a workspace that's under your templates. So you should have access to that. Even, if you're have your own template workspace that you brought in, if you want to kind of look at some of those searches and kind of pull the goodness out of them, feel free to do so.
I do also want to note for the review workspace, there is a learning path on our community site for the review workspace, as well as our ECA template that has, I don't know, I think the videos are maybe in total like 45 minutes, but they're broken down into smaller chunks to kind of walk you through the workflows that are built into these templates. So if you want to take a look at those to kind of get an idea of what the searches are, where they're located, as well as the workflow ideas behind them, certainly take a look at those learning paths on our community site.
Yeah, and if you're on server too, it's still like, some of the things and features are going to look a little bit different, but the workflows and the concepts are often, going to be exactly the same. So still can be helpful too. Question, is there a way to make only OCR production documents containing redactions equal to yes rather than the default of no? Good feedback, Matt. We'll look to add that and pass it along to the team as well. Not a current way to do that, but again, if you create the first production, if you create the first set and like copy from it, you can. Sorry, OCR set, not production, but we'll pass it along. That's not bad feedback. A couple things about the recorded video. It will be available on our self-paced webinar page. Like I said, within 24 hours, typically these are up in there. So you should be able to take a look at it, pass it along to anyone who might have missed that call that would like to see this. There's a question about searchable PDFs and being able to export those using the RDC or integration points. So if you are, depending on what version of Relativity, I know Relativity 1, for example, does have the ability to export out PDFs via the mass action. So you could run a production within Relativity 1 and then use the mass action PDF, and that will actually export out searchable PDFs for you. And I have found that to be a pretty darn fast route of going. The nice part about within Relativity 1, it is actually decoupled from imaging and processing as well. So not going to bog down any of those other functions too. So that'd be my recommendation there. Oh, wow, we're getting hot on time, Jill. Any last question? I think we're pretty much got one more.
Yep, I think, well, there's. Pick one, John. I see there's a couple in here, so.
Let's see. God, there's a lot. We might have to, you know what? Maybe for any of these questions we're unable to answer, we'll try to take a look at them and see if we can get some answers back to you. So appreciate all the questions though. Let's see. Oh man, can you write? I'm just trying to see. There's a lot of questions still left. There's one about email threading. You know, should you check redact and privilege for that as part of your standard QC? You know, obviously with email threading and depending on your review, right? Are you doing an inclusive review? What type of production are you going to do as a result of that? You can always use the email thread visualization option to kind of check for both coding and if there's any different coding. So, you know, it's always good to potentially look at those email threads and see where they are. As far as QC goes, again, it's more along the lines of how are you planning on producing? Are you producing like, you know, documents that hit on terms and are responsive? Are you supposed to include like full thread groups or not, right? Oftentimes it's more based, you know, and at least in my experience, was more based on like, hey, we're producing full families that are responsive, hit on our search terms. We oftentimes didn't really have to be like, you know, trying to figure out, do we have to produce the full thread group? Jill, correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but I don't really remember having to dive too much into thread group checks.
Sorry, I had some really loud planes flying over me. You know, if you're producing just inclusive documents, I don't necessarily think this is a check you would need to do. But if you're producing full threads, certainly run some of those similar conflict checks, like I mentioned, through the knowledge base article prior to setting up some of these pre-production checks as part of your review process.
All right. Well, we are at time. Obviously appreciate all of your attendance, all your questions. We'll do our best to try to get back to some of those questions that we were unable to answer. So thank you for all those and thank you for joining today.
Thank you.